several sessions now, I've made it a priority to expand voter participation and remove obstacles to assessing the ballot. Just a minute. Okay, we've tried to remove obstacles to assessing the ballot. Most recently, we successfully in the legislature passed into law the automatic voting registration, a bill that expands those state agencies that automatically register individuals to vote unless they opt out. And I worked with the coalition to do that, and that we did in the last session. I've been lead sponsor of legislation to allow same-day voter registration so that you're not turned away from the polls for not being registered. My hope is that in this Votes Act, that this is the right time to do same-day registration. We wouldn't be the first state to do it, so I look forward to that happening now as well. But this is really probably the most ambitious voting bill that I filed yet, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. While I'm the lead sponsor of the bill known as the Voting Act, I'm working with an incredible coalition known as the Election Modernization Coalition. The coalition is made up of activists and well-known organizations whose energy and expertise will be critical to gaining passage of the Votes Act into law. I am joined tonight by two amazing members of the Election Modernization Coalition, both of whom I have a history of working with for a long time. I want to mention that the group that's made up a full coalition, which is Common Cause, Massachusetts, Mass Vote, ACLU of Massachusetts, Voter Table, MassPIRG, Lawyers for Civil Rights, and the League of Women Voters, all of whom have a lot to say about this bill and who have been in support, totally in support with all of the complexities of this new bill. And if there are members from any of those organizations that are not on the formal agenda, if you want to speak, please do that. The Votes Act, in short, is a comprehensive legislation to expand and increase voter participation and modernize our election registration system. Amongst other things, it builds on the success of the recent election, expanded voting options, and seeks to make them permanent. Expanding voter participation is critical to ensuring that all votes and voices are heard in our democracy. And after everything our country went through last fall, this is the time for the Commonwealth to consider these bold measures to protect our democracy. We want to build on this momentum. Along with the Votes Act, I know there is no shortage among my colleagues in the legislature of additional election reforms. Now, let's get into the details of the Votes Act. Joining us tonight from Common Cause of Massachusetts is their new executive director, Geoff Foster. Now, I have to say that if I had the pleasure of working with Geoff in his previous position at UTEC, a most incredible organization based in Lowell that works with emerging adults who have been involved in the criminal justice system. I know that he will do a great job in Common Cause because he did an amazing job in UTEC. So thank you, Geoff. We're also joined by Rahsaan Hall, the Director of Racial Justice Programs at the ACLU of Mass. I've also worked closely with Rahsaan, most recently on the police reform bill. And thank you, Rahsaan, for all that you do and the impact that you have on all of the legislation that I've been working on. So Geoff and Rahsaan are going to give us an overview of the Votes Act and discuss why it's important to make our voting system stronger, more secure, and more equitable. And they'll tell you what votes really means, that it's an acronym for something. And so I think they've worked out who goes first, and I think it will be Geoff. Just one housekeeping, and I hate to do this because once you mention somebody, you may have missed somebody. So I'm just going to go through a few names of people that I saw come in. I don't know if she's here yet, but I know Representative Peisch it was going to be here. Lonnie Powers, who really was so active in Mass Legal Services, David Sullivan, who we couldn't be without with Common Cause, so smart. Betsy DeWitt, thank you for what you do in Brookline. Barry White, Ambassador White, Cindy Rowe from JALSA, and Brian Barish, who's running for City Council. So with that, Geoff, please. And if I forgot somebody, let me know, text me, raise your hand, and I'll be looking for it. Thank you. Go ahead.
Actually, Senator Creem, I'm going to go first, but I think Geoff also needs permission to unmute. But I can pick it up from here, but that's fine. Thank you so much, Senator Creem. Not only
right, I'm sorry. Yeah,
yeah, that's fine. Thanks not only for the introduction, but also your ongoing support of the legislative efforts to ensure equitable and fair elections in the Commonwealth, like the Votes Act, but also all of the other things that you have mentioned that we've had an opportunity to work on. You have been a stalwart for justice in this fight. So it's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Rahsaan Hall, Director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU. The Election Modernization Coalition has been working together for about 10 years on a variety of voting rights issues and have had great success making elections more fair and accessible for all of the citizens of Massachusetts. And our steering committee, as Senator Creem mentioned, is the ACLU, Common Cause, Lawyers for Civil Rights, League of Women Voters, Mass PERG, Mass Vote, the Mass Voter Table. But there are also a host of other groups that are involved, from La Comunidad, Vote New Bedford, Rosie's Place, Neighbor to Neighbor, Worcester Interfaith, the Mass Housing Alliance, and so many other groups, too many to mention tonight. But we work together in this large coalition that are all supportive of the various legislative initiatives that we've championed, like automatic voter registration, or pre and online registration, or adoption of the ERIC system, and most recently, the COVID-19 voting protections last year that ensured that Massachusetts voters didn't have to choose between their health and safety and exercising their right to vote. And so tonight, we're going to talk about the success of last year, but also, and maybe more importantly, what we need to do this year. So for that, I'll turn it over to Geoff.
Thanks so much, Rahsaan, and thanks again so much, Senator, and for your whole team for your leadership on this issue. We're just so excited to make this a priority at Common Cause Massachusetts. And for folks who don't know, Common Cause is a national organization. We have over 30 state chapters, and I'm very lucky to be able to join the team here in Massachusetts to advance policies that remove barriers and strengthen our democracy. And so very excited to join the Election Modernization Coalition and work on this really important and timely bill.
Very cool.
The senator said it best. I don't think there's a single person in this country that didn't have some sort of relationship with voting last fall. I think it came really front and center on January 6th, when we all saw in horror what played out the US Capitol building. And not only was that a direct physical attack on our democracy, it was also a symbol, as we saw many states across the country begin to play defense against really terrible state legislative efforts to further restrict voting and to further disenfranchise populations. And so thanks to the Senator and State Representative John Lawn on the House side, we have a unique opportunity here in Massachusetts to play some offense and to move our democracy in the right direction here. And the Senator said it best. This is all about making our democracy in Massachusetts more equitable, more accessible, and more secure. And so every item in the Votes Act really is targeted at those values. And so Rahsaan and I are going to go back and forth on some of the key items in the bill. And when we're done, we're willing with the Senator to field questions you all have. And so first off, one of the immediate key items in the Votes Act, which the Votes Act is an acronym, and the bill itself is an act fostering voting opportunities, trust, equity, and security. And on the Senate side, it's Senate docket 1002. And so the Votes Act is very popular already. Both with the Senate and the House bill, we have over 83 co-sponsors and counting at this point, which is really impressive for a bill that's just 4 weeks old. So really popular, a lot of indication that there's many members in the legislature who are willing to push our democracy in the right direction this session. So first and foremost in the Votes Act is making permanent the expansions that the legislature passed last year to accommodate for COVID. And so some key items in that are making the mail-in voting system, which was hugely popular. I don't know how many of you voted by mail. I did, my wife did. We loved it. We thought it was great. And so this bill will make that system permanent, which includes such great features as paid postage. So we're really excited about that. And it will also make permanent the expansions to early in-person voting so that up to 2 weeks before an election day, voters, if they so choose, can go to a designated location in advance and vote in person. And so we're really excited about these expansions. We think that not only did it make sense from a public health perspective during the COVID-19 pandemic, but we think it makes sense from a democracy perspective. Fun fact, last fall in the state primary, there was over a 400% increase in voter turnout. 400% voter turnout. That's something that has to open everyone's eyes and make us really excited about the fact that we can connect these kind of policies to opening the doors to democracy even wider here in Massachusetts. These two items are really also intentional, and there's added language in this bill that really takes into account the fact that our clerks, our election office officials on the local level were really the true heroes last year, working on the front lines of the pandemic to make sure that our elections were administered as best as they could be. And so there's some added language in this bill that makes these things permanent, but also would allow for municipalities to get rid of checkout tables and to even opt in to starting early tabulations for some of the mail-in and early in-person votes. And we know that this will cut down on a lot of the hard work that those frontline staff have to do on and after Election Day. So that's the first 2 bullet points of the Votes Act. I'm going to pass it to Rahsaan to talk about a few more.
So one of the next ones is same-day registration. For those who are familiar with the Election Modernization Coalition, you know that in the past we have advocated for Election Day registration. So why are we now advocating for same-day registration, and what's the difference? Well, Election Day registration allows for people who are eligible to vote to register on Election Day and cast their ballot. EDR, Election Day registration, is limited, however, to Election Day. And what same-day registration does is expands that opportunity to those who are registered, or those who register when they go to cast their ballot in person during early voting period, as well as on Election Day. And so if we believe that the greatest value to be derived from our representative democracy comes from as many eligible citizens participating in the process, then we must ensure that everyone who is eligible has access to that process. We also understand that everyone's lives are complicated, right? And there are a wide variety of reasons that people aren't able to make or actually end up missing the registration deadline. We know that thousands of voters who are otherwise eligible in the past have filled out registration forms and submitted them after the deadline, and their information is entered into the registration database. But because of this arbitrary cutoff, they cannot cast a ballot. A 20-day deadline in Massachusetts, which is what we currently have, was established without any justification as to why it needs to be 20 days as opposed to 10 days or 5 days or Election Day. That said, at the time of that 20-day deadline when it was enacted, technology and electoral administration were in a very different place. Since then, there have been 21 states that have adopted some form of same-day registration and have successfully administered their elections. And it's overwhelmingly used by people who are already registered to vote to update their registration. This policy is also an important racial justice initiative because people of color are disproportionately accounted among the populations that same-day registration advantages the most. People who move a lot, young people, and people who are in lower socioeconomic status. So same-day registration is an important component of this bill. The next, if somebody can hit me, there we go. The next provision is jail-based voting, which is another racial equity aspect of this bill. See, in Massachusetts, people who are detained pre-trial or held on bail, presumed innocent, have not yet been proven guilty, have not been disenfranchised or otherwise lost their right to vote. Similarly, people who are incarcerated serving a sentence on a misdemeanor case are still eligible to vote. And so this reform ensures that the people who are eligible to vote and incarcerated, which is serving a misdemeanor sentence or detained on pretrial or some other type of administrative hold, can access ballots. It requires sheriffs to ensure that they can access ballot applications and other information related to voting. A perfect example of why this is necessary is an example from a county where there were 13 out of anywhere between 300 to 400 eligible individuals who were incarcerated there. Only 13 cast a ballot. We can no longer allow those types of rates to exist. This is a racial justice reform because we know all too well the racial disparities in who is charged, detained, and prosecuted across the Commonwealth. So we must make sure that everyone who is eligible to vote has unfettered and uninterrupted access to the ballot. Geoff?
Thanks, Rahsaan. Really excited about that provision as well. And I would just like to say, I think, folks might say, well, shouldn't we be focused on policies that impact the most number of people? I think everything that we've gone through as a Commonwealth and as a country this past year demands that we pay close attention as well with an equity lens. And so I just really appreciate the senator. The senator insisted when we were talking about what made sense for the strongest legislation this session. The senator was really stern in her leadership, making sure that this was an area we focused on, and we're in full support of that. So thank you again, Senator. One other piece of the Votes Act that's really important, it's not really glamorous, but it's hugely important. And that is what's called risk limiting audits. And so post-election audits played a hugely important role in the presidential election this past fall. And so in Massachusetts, under current law, we're required every 4 years when there's a presidential election to do a post-election audit that has a 3% tabulation, a hand count of votes in randomized precincts across the state to compare the tabulated votes in the voting machines to what real people see on the ballots in terms of the bullets that have been filled in, the circles that have been filled in. And so what risk limiting audits are is really a national gold standard for post-election audits. And so the change here proposed in the Votes Act would require post-election audits to be conducted more frequently, so every 2 years in any state election. And it would also require risk limiting thresholds to be implemented. And what that means is that risk limiting audits require at least a 95% or above confidence rate when the Secretary of Commonwealth looks and compares a manual count of votes to how the machines are tabulating results. So in most cases, Massachusetts exceeds that confidence rate. But what risk limiting audits do is if there's ever a precinct or multiple communities where there's some sort of discrepancy between the machines, whether it's the machine was broken or anything, the risk limiting audit would ensure that there would have to be a growing number of precincts assessed until at the state level, they felt that there was at least a 95% confidence rate in those results. We're not there in Massachusetts right now. And what happened last fall was 2 states that use risk limiting audits really made these kind of post-election audits popular. Those 2 states were Pennsylvania and Georgia. Now, the fact that both of those states dealt with seriously challenging legal matters by the Trump campaign, Rudy Giuliani, and others to try to claim that there were delegitimate results and there was widespread voter fraud. Well, even in Georgia, with the Republican Secretary of State, the use of risk limiting audits resulted in such high confidence by key stakeholders that the cases held no water in courts. And we believe, we're selfish, but we believe Massachusetts deserves that level of post-election confidence and security. And so we're not missing this opportunity to push Massachusetts to be a little bit better. And so that's why risk limiting audits are being proposed in the Votes Act. Rahsaan?
And so finally, there are a couple of fixes that will build off our past successes by setting a deadline by which the Secretary of the Commonwealth must join the Election Registration Information Center, or ERIC, and fix automatic voter registration, or AVR. ERIC is a registration information system run by the participating states that helps ensure a state's voter rolls are up to date. Unfortunately, 1 in 8 voter registrations are inaccurate for a whole host of reasons. People move, they die, they change their names, but that information doesn't automatically update on the voter rolls. ERIC helps ensure that the rolls are up to date by accessing a variety of state and federal databases to ensure accuracy. That data is anonymized and protected and controlled by the states that participate in the ERIC system. And so in 2018, Massachusetts made joining ERIC the law, bringing Massachusetts into a network of 30 states and the District of Columbia. However, the Secretary of the Commonwealth has failed to join. This bill will take care of that issue by setting a date certain by which we must join. And with regards to fixes of automatic voter registration, this bill will tweak the current practice that will increase registration. In 2018, again, when AVR was passed, the law required voters to be given an opportunity to opt out of their automatic voter registration after their AVR transaction, or what's called back-end AVR. So you go to the registry of the motor vehicle, or you're signing up for public assistance. After you've done all that, it informs you that you're registered and you can opt out at that point. Unfortunately, Secretary Galvin implemented a system that allows people to opt out at the point of transaction, or front-end AVR. It's important that the law be implemented as enacted. Research shows that back-end AVR increases voter registration. It's the gold standard, again, and all of the reforms we are seeking, from mail-in voting to same-day registration to these risk-limiting audits, are seeking to create the opportunity for us to realize a sustained participation in our electoral politics at levels consistent with or surpassing what we saw last year. So we encourage you to reach out to your elected officials and make sure they are supporting the Votes Act. And if you're represented by Senator Creem, you're already halfway there. But don't stop there. Reach out to your family and friends and coworkers and the organizations that you're a part of, and encourage them to take this on as a legislative priority. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Senator Creem. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank everybody for all their good work here. And I do know, I don't know if David Sullivan wants to say a few words, or we go right to the questions. David, did you want to say a few words, or?
I'd be happy to help answer questions, Senator, but I think
Okay.
Geoff and Rahsaan have done a great job.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to go the questions that are in the chat and see. I froze before, so I had to change my what I was using. So let me see if I can go to the beginning. How does Margaret Emerson asked, how does same-day registration work? So Geoff or Rahsaan, somebody want to answer that?
I mean, part of it is ensuring that we have up-to-date information, and being enrolled in ERIC helps facilitate that. And so people appear at the registration, at the polling location, fill out the registration, and that is validated, and people are allowed to cast a ballot. I think another thing that's important to recognize with same-day registrations that a lot of the people who are using same-day registration are people who are already registered to vote, but sometimes their names aren't showing up on the list because of some technical or misinformation that's been included on their registration. So, or they've moved. They just need to update their registration. And so having an updated, robust registration system helps with that.
Okay, so I don't know whether my chat is picking everybody up. So let's see if we go now. Susan Chattis had a question. Do you think making election day a holiday would make it easier for people to vote? Geoff or Rahsaan, do you want to take that?
So I'm happy to answer, and actually I want to just appreciate Jeffrey Axelrod, who I think captured it in the chat as well. Look, any policy recommendation that's proven to increase voter turnout and reduce barriers to voting, game on. When we were working with our coalition partners, and there are many stakeholders involved in the conversation around this legislation, we thought exactly what Jeffrey raised, which is allowing for early in-person voting gives folks the flexibility over a 2-week window to pick a time that works for them. And obviously, if they don't ever have time in the windows that an election office or early voting location is open, then they can capture it with the mail-in opportunity. One group I think is really important to lift up right now that comes to mind, and that's nurses and frontline staff who are dealing with 12+ hour shifts in hospitals and medical care facilities, working to combat the public health crisis of COVID-19. And so I just imagine someone in that job coming home from a 12, 13, 14-hour shift, exhausted, relaxing, having a glass of wine, and being able at 11 o'clock at night to fill out their mail-in ballot and get counted. And so, we're not opposed to making Election Day a holiday, but we do think that this is a stronger policy recommendation to accommodate everybody, whoever they are and however, they choose to vote.
And just to underscore that, one of my colleagues from the ACLU, Rudy Philemon, who chimed in the chat, also said everybody doesn't have holidays off, even if it's made a holiday. Everybody.
And Geoff, Rudy, do you want to say anything more? I saw that in the chat. Rudy might be muted.
Yeah, I think Rudy's all set.
Okay, what about Geoff Axelrod? He had a question. Yes, but he had a comment that being able to vote for 2 weeks before the election date seems a better alternative to making an election day holiday. Geoff, did you have anything else you wanted to ask, or I think he's okay. I'm trying to, Geoff, did you have something else?
Can you hear me? Oh, good. Yeah, I see myself there. So yeah, I was wondering, it sounded like almost like a subjective standard, the 95% confidence rate. And I'd like to better understand who makes that call and on what basis do they make their call? Is there some kind of resource or reference to an objective standard of any kind?
Geoff or Rahsaan, you want to take that?
David, do you want that one?
Sure, I'll take it. So let me introduce myself. I'm David Sullivan. I'm on the Common Cause board. I'm a lawyer, I'm sorry to say. And I've had the pleasure of working with Senator Creem over many years since I've been on the Senate staff, at one point as Senate legal counsel. So thank you, Senator, for sponsoring this bill and for sponsoring this discussion. On the subject of risk limiting audits, this is really a national effort by a whole bunch of voter friendly organizations, including National Common Cause. And as Geoff mentioned earlier, a bunch of states have already adopted this very successfully. The 95% threshold is, frankly, an arbitrary standard. You have to pick a number. And the Secretary of State is the one responsible for deciding whether that standard has been met, subject to judicial review. So it's not totally arbitrary. The Secretary can't do whatever he wants. And there have to be random drawings to decide exactly which precincts get reviewed as part of this risk limiting audit. So the experience of other states, and as Geoff mentioned, that included Georgia after last year's presidential election, is that this is a really helpful tool to increase confidence among voters and everybody else about the legitimacy and accuracy of the election result. And it is something that courts have reviewed and found helpful. And that was definitely the case in Georgia last year, where essentially, just to be on the safe side, the secretary decided to recount every single ballot in the state as a part of this process. And it turned out that very few votes were changed in any fashion. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, now we have a question from Sid Gelb. Hi, Sid. About, can Congress pass similar laws, or does it have to be state by state? Geoff, I want to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, Congress can certainly do this. And in fact, for folks paying attention, the House in DC was debating HR 1 today, in which there were many positive amendments added. And so, yes, and you know, states have the ability to do a lot of this as well. And so, you know, again, I think we applaud Congress and what they can get accomplished right now with the opportunity they have. While at the same time, we're really excited about our state legislature moving us forward in certain ways as well. And as much as I'm excited to see federal law around election reform and moving us in the right direction, I also think it's really important, particularly in a state like Massachusetts, to not necessarily wait for, you know, the national climate to be ready for some of these innovations that our state legislature might be ready to do quicker. So I appreciate that. I think we support on all levels, and we're really excited, particularly about doing this at the state level here in Massachusetts.
Can I just add one thing to Geoff's excellent comment?
Yes, yes.
In addition to HR 1, which is the bill that the federal House is debating probably as we speak, there is another bill called HR 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that would strengthen the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, as you may know, the Supreme Court sort of gutted in an important way in 2013 in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. That bill is also very important. And just to respond to some other questions in the chat, you know, what can we do about states that are moving in the other direction from Massachusetts, that are actually trying to suppress the vote and make it harder for people to vote? And the answer is, you know, apart from organizing in those states, which Common Cause and the ACLU and other organizations are doing throughout the United States, the most important thing is to get Congress to pass both of those bills, to put some guardrails in place to stop bad things from happening in other states. And I'm happy to say that the entire Massachusetts congressional delegation is behind both of those, including both of our senators and Congressman Auchincloss, who I know represents you. You know, we're fortunate in that respect, but the hard part there is going to be getting it through the Senate, which, as you may know, has a filibuster that might require 60 votes unless we do something about it. And that's a whole nother discussion for another day, but these are very important issues at the national level.
Thank you. So the next question, and I probably should answer that, do you see reasons why this bill would not pass this session and become law? So I guess I'm the only one of the three of us that can actually answer that. It's amazing to me, but thousands and thousands of bills get filed and so few pass. Something is going to pass. The question is, will it include all of the options and things that we had here? This is not my first time filing a same-day registration. I did that before. I've done it, and I tried, and I couldn't get it passed, and I do think that it is going to pass this year. There are questions in this bill about, do you mail ballots or don't you mail ballots? What if people move? What happens? We think if the ERIC system is in place, that those problems won't be problems. But so I can say clearly that something will pass, but maybe not some of the sweeping changes that we hope. And I think this is the time, and I think we have to go for the most that we can get here. And I hope it's not just a small token. But when we first did, I was involved with the Secretary of State and of course with Common Cause and David. And when we first did our bill on mail-in ballots, and there were skeptics, and some of those skeptics were the town clerks that thought they'd never be able to do that. How could they work on it? What would it mean? And the interesting thing is that they're the ones that are asking for us to do the mail-in ballots now. So that is something that I think we will see. Whether we will see the early registration, the 2 weeks, what those things mean, that remains to be seen. And when you say who's opposed, well, there's some money involved, and there are still skeptics that say, well, this opens it up for fraud or this or that. So those are arguments which we don't think are strong, but they may be coming from some people. And so that's sort of the answer to Deborah Beck's question is, what is the opposition and how strong is it? We haven't had a hearing yet. So I think when the bill gets heard, which it will get heard before the Election Commission, I think, we'll hear more. But everything has someone opposed to it. I've learned that in my years of being in the Senate. But we feel this is the right time to move. So I don't know if Geoff or Rahsaan want to add anything to that, but.
No, I really appreciate that, Senator. Again, I would point to the fact that the bill is not 4 weeks old, and almost 50% of the legislature has co-sponsored it.
Right.
And it's really across a political spectrum in the Democratic Party. But I wouldn't be surprised if eventually we even saw some Republicans support these. And so, I think right now the legislature is excited to do something. And just last week, the speaker came out and endorsed making mail-in voting permanent. And so obviously that's a good indication of there's a conversation to be had. And I just want to answer too, I know someone asked, what can advocates and citizens do? And I would just say, I think the first thing now is, as was mentioned earlier by Rahsaan, if you live in a district and you see your legislator has not yet co-sponsored the bill, certainly reaching out would be good. This is a good time to do that. And then for everyone else, when the bill does come up for a public hearing, and we hope it comes up quickly, they just named committee chairs, and we know that there's going to be some time to get things settled. But we do hope that these will get, the Votes Act will get a quick public hearing, and we would obviously welcome everyone to participate, submit testimony, and join in that process as well. And perhaps at the end, Rahsaan and I we'll put our email addresses in the chat. And if folks want to drop us an email, we can make sure we plug you into our email lists to keep you involved.
Great, thank you. So there's a question from Susan Chattis. Well, the question of Susan Chattis, Janet King felt was very important. And it was a question of, can we help the suppressed voters in other states? I think we can do that if we pass federal legislation.
Yeah, that's to David's point, right? Like making sure this federal legislation is passed, but also by passing it here in Massachusetts to show what an example of good voting laws look like and good voting practices are, and be able to show like we implement these practices and the sky doesn't fall on us, right? There's not rampant voter fraud or anything like that. So I think it's a both and, doing the pushing for the federal legislation to be passed, but also being an example.
I mean, I think they found there wasn't voter fraud in Georgia, even though skeptics thought there was. And so when you say who's opposed, that still comes up, the question of voter fraud. And that's why, we have to show that in other places where they did this, there just wasn't voter fraud.
And I just want to appreciate, Susan, the point, right? But I think to the extent that there is really kind of clear disenfranchisement in other states, knowing that some urgency should be reserved for us at home here. There are long lines in some communities in Massachusetts, particularly, disproportionately communities of color, that we should just be as concerned about, right? And when we talk about making sure we have codified systems in place for eligible incarcerated voters, look, the senator has been a leader for many years in criminal justice reform, and the reality is in Massachusetts, roughly 50% of incarcerated people in our jail systems are pretrial, meaning they're innocent, many of whom are in jail only because they can't afford some fees and fines to get out. And so you think about the intersection between racial justice work and the recent work the legislature did around criminal justice reform, there are still a block of eligible voters under law who have the full right to vote, but because they're incarcerated, it's that much more difficult. And so I really do think that as much as it is important for us to stay upset and angry about what we're hearing in other states, that we also know that we can reserve some of the outrage and urgency for the work that needs to be done here in Massachusetts.
And I want to just echo about having people incarcerated able to vote. This bill does not give anybody a right to vote who's incarcerated that didn't have it before. It does not do that, although people may say that it does. These are people mostly, as Geoff said, 50%, who probably, and likely many, won't even end up being incarcerated. These aren't felons. These are people that legitimately have the right to vote. And in some of our prisons, they're stifled. They don't have the cards, the things to do to vote. They're not allowed to. And so I'm really pleased in racial justice that that piece is here. I wanted to stop for a minute. I know Representative Peisch is here, my friend, and I don't want to put you on the spot, and if you had to hop off, that's okay. But I wanted to know if you wanted to add anything or say anything. I know you weren't here in the beginning when I called your name, and I just wanted to see, Alice, if you wanted to hop in or say something.
Well, thank you, Cindy. This is your forum, not mine. So I'm happy to
together.
I'm just happy to listen, but I knew there would be a lot of Wellesley of our overlapping constituents on, so I wanted to be sure that I heard what they heard. Now, I'm already a co-sponsor of the bill, and I think everything that's been said to date is accurate. And the biggest thing I think in terms of getting this through, which I think Cindy you've already mentioned, is things. Nothing was perfect, but the mail-in voting situation went very well. I think was very popular. And I think that laid to rest a lot of skepticism that there might have been beforehand. So I'm very optimistic that that's, as you said, Cindy, some form of this will get through, and hopefully most of it. And we'll work on the issues that might not be as popular with everyone. And if it doesn't have, if we, in the legislature, if you get most of it, you're pretty happy. So that's and I'm sure we will get most of it. And what we don't get, we'll keep trying on next time, right?
Right. We know that you don't get it all. And so let me just go. Thank you, Alice, and look forward to working with you on this. What everybody knows is nothing happens unless it happens in both the House and the Senate. So thank you for your work as well.
Thanks.
Okay, so I want to get down, there were some more questions. So one question, I think we touched on it, but what can we do as activists and citizens to promote the Votes Act? And I think by putting, getting in touch with Geoff or Rahsaan or me, we can put my, my email as well. We can let you know when there's a hearing. I'm sure the league will be sending out to its members as well as the ACLU and Common Cause, and coming to the hearing, or well, virtually. We don't go anywhere anymore. Or sending cards to friends, or sending, notes to people in the legislature that you support it is really what we need to do to promote this. So we welcome citizen input is really important. Again, the issue with same-day registration, this year I was very excited because we have the Secretary of State on board. So that makes a big difference in some of these different points that are in this bill. The next question was, if Congress passes HR 1 and HR 4, can the states undo this federal legislation? I might need David again. I don't think they can, but
No. The federal Constitution has this thing called the Supremacy Clause, which means if Congress passes a law and it's constitutional, which it is, it's binding on the states. So the states can't mess around with it. And that's why it's so important, because it can really rein in some of the more abusive practices that we're hearing about. The Georgia House just yesterday passed a really bad bill to cut back on a lot of the early voting and mail voting that occurred that successfully, from my point of view, at least in that state last year. And the other thing that's worth mentioning, by the way, is that we now have a Justice Department with a Civil Rights Division and a voting section in that agency that's actually going to enforce these laws, which is really critical. And you know, the people, the new chief of the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department is a woman named Kristen Clark, who was the head of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights at the national level. That Lawyers Committee is one of our constituent organizations in the coalition. Their national head is now in charge of enforcing these laws. So that's a huge deal and a huge important change that will go hand in hand with all this other stuff.
great. Thank you, David. So there are many, there was a question about the deadline for counting ballots. Does it extend beyond? I think Betsy DeWitt asked, there are many excellent improvements here. Is the deadline for counting ballots extended beyond Election Day? Yes, if Rahsaan or Geoff want to answer that. Either?
I can take that
Yeah,
too.
David, since you
sorry,
wrote it. No, go ahead, since you wrote it.
Well, I helped to write it. Just like last year, in the state general election only, so in the November election, we proposed to count ballots that were mailed by Election Day and received up to 3 days later by the clerk. So up to Friday after the election, if the ballot was mailed by Election Day and gets there by Friday at 5 o'clock, it will be counted. That's only true for the general election, because the problem with the primary is, currently at least, there's very little time between the primary and the general election. So you really need to figure out the result of the primary as soon as possible. And it does seem that the general election is the usually the place where these kinds of issues come up.
And I guess, and maybe David, could you say a little more about the process of counting before Election Day? Because what we saw on January 6th, in large part, was because of state legislatures that did not allow for the early preparation to enable clerks to begin the count. So I think that's another.
That's absolutely right, Rahsaan. So one thing we did last year, we're proposing to codify. Last year's reforms, probably should be clear about this, expired, most of them, at the end of last year. So what we're doing a lot of right now is making them permanent, right? Geoff mentioned that earlier. This is one of them. We allowed mail ballots and early voting ballots to be counted, not counted, but processed, tabulated before Election Day, fed into the scanners, in other words, but not to have the results revealed until the polls close on Election Day. That's a huge, talking about clerks and how hard they work, which they do. This will really make their jobs easier, because under pre-existing law, they couldn't start to process those ballots until Election Day. And Rahsaan's also right about the fact that this was a huge problem in some other states. I had the privilege of working on voter protection in Pennsylvania last year. And Pennsylvania is one of those states where the Republican legislature would not let ballots. This is an intentional act by them, because the Democratic governor had requested this, and they refused to do it. would not let the ballots be counted until election day or even processed. And as a result, it took almost a week after election day in Pennsylvania to know who won. And that does not foster public confidence in the result. And of course, our former president took full advantage of that situation by claiming that the election was being stolen from him. No, it wasn't being stolen. The ballots were being counted more slowly than we would like. So that's what that's about.
I love the sound of that word, former. And I'll just say, if anyone has volunteered to be a poll worker, I've served as a poll warden before, you know how difficult it is, even dealing with the absentee ballots that arrive that get added later on, or finding those moments in time when there's a slow moment to add them in. So just think about the increase of ballots that had been received through mail-in voting. So this is a very important provision.
Okay, so the next question was, what was the, again from Sid Gelb, what is the objection to having Massachusetts use the system used in Maine to require 50%? I think that's a ranked choice question. I don't think that is really in this bill. So maybe we could take that offline, Sid, but I think, I don't know if that, Geoff, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, just a 10-second. It's not in the bill. I think despite it still being a policy that we support, and I know our partners support, it really, because, you know, the question did not pass on the ballot last fall, you know, I think we're taking our cues from voters on this issue. I will share that there still remains a lot of interest in certain municipalities. And so we are excited to see if, on the local level, if municipal governments pursue this option now. I know that it passed in a lot of the larger gateway cities and, you know, some of the larger communities across the Commonwealth. But yeah, we feel like the timing's not right because it, you know, it didn't pass on the ballot, and we didn't think it would make it out of the gate this session. But there's still some interest, and if folks want to talk more offline about it, I'm happy to chat.
Thanks, Geoff. So the other one was, what part of the bill does Senator Creem think will pass? Oh my God, I don't have my looking glass today, or my wishing well, or I never know. I might know better after the hearing. I certainly think mail-in ballots is going to pass. I certainly hope that election day registration passes, but I'm not sure I really know the answer to that question. But stay tuned. Sign up for my newsletter if you don't get it. So the next question is from Janet King, which says, how can we lobby other state leaders to push for fair voting in their states? I think I'm worried about running out of time. So I think I'm going to say that by joining forces with organizations like Common Cause and ACLU and other of the members of the coalition, I know for a fact this is not the only state that they're making noise in. I know for a fact that they're working hard to try and file bills in other states to do similar things. So, you know, we always say, as Massachusetts goes, there goes other things. But unfortunately, in election day registration, 21 states already have that and we don't. But so I'm going to answer and say, get in touch with Common Cause or ACLU because they're working elsewhere too. The next question is from Patrick Roth. I'm trying to stay within the 1 hour, so I'm sorry if I'm moving quick here. Can we help counter suppression in other states by modeling how elections can be done? What Rahsaan said. Rahsaan? Sorry.
Yeah, I think Patrick, who's on the board of Common Cause, was reiterating a point that I made in response to someone else's question, right, Patrick? Great.
Okay. All right, so Susan, again, while the Justice Department is now functioning, we have a Supreme Court that gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby versus Holder. Is this the only fix that having Congress pass the John Lewis voting rights law? David, maybe that's for you.
Well, again, very topical question. So today in the United States Supreme Court, a case was argued called Branovich versus Republican Party from Arizona that has to do with exactly that question, which is Section 2 of the existing Voting Rights Act, which is the main tool that's still left, and exactly how it should be applied. And we have to wait for the court to decide that case to know exactly how much we have left of that important tool, the Voting Rights Act, that still exists and still hopefully imposes some restraints on what states that are trying to suppress the vote can do. So as Senator Cream said, stay tuned.
Okay, so I think that's the end of our questions. I just was trying to see if we could put some of your email addresses for Jeff or David or Rahsaan and ours in the chat, so that if you have any questions, Jeff just put his in. We're really looking for your support on this, and we're looking for you to be around to make some noise as we get closer to passing this bill. So thank you all for coming on this evening. And mostly, I do want to thank my partners in crime here, the Common Cause and the ACLU. It's always good to do these things with you, and super. Thank you so much. Have a good night. Enjoy yourself. If anyone hasn't had dinner, enjoy your dinner. And we'll be doing another Zoom soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.